Well, I think we'll get started. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. And I'm so happy that all of you were able to join us today. And I know we have participants from all over the world. So this is always so wonderful for us, knowing that we have attracted such a global audience, and we want to thank you so much for choosing to spend this hour with us here at the Weatherhead Center and the program on negotiation at Harvard. And I just want to remind you that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, as well as the program on negotiation at the law school. And we are just thrilled and delighted to have Dr. Bruno Verdini here to start us off this semester in the first Kelman Seminar. And as you know, the title of his talk is Negotiating Persuasively in a Volatile Climate. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce him. And but before that, I just want to give thanks to everyone behind the scenes who are always helping to make this seminar possible. Diane Long and James Kerwin, and notably also we have the fairly new managing director. She started last semester, but she's new to the Kelman Seminar and showing her face here with us at the Kelman Seminar. So we have Nicole Bryant, the new managing director, and she's going to say just a few words of welcome. So go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Donna, and hello to everyone. It is so delightful to see where you're coming in from, and it is a pleasure for the program on negotiation to be partnering with the Weatherhead Center on these seminars. We believe that these topics are impactful and interesting and have a really important place in our discussions. And so I'm delighted that PON is here, that we are kicking off this semester's worth of virtual programming. We will be having Kelman seminars as well as PON live events throughout the semester. So I will say a word about some things that are coming up at the end of the program, but just wanted to thank the Weatherhead Center for their sponsorship, and of course, Bruno Verdini for agreeing to lead this session today. And now I'll turn it back over to Donna.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. And just to remind you that the speaker, Bruno, will be speaking for about 30-35 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A with all of you. And if you would, please put your questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll go through them. And I know we're not going to get to all of them, but we will, hopefully we'll be able to get at least 20 minutes into a discussion back and forth. And so now I'd like to introduce Dr. Bruno Verdini. He is a specialist in negotiation, communication, and diplomacy and leadership, and is also the author of the MIT Press's best-selling Winning Together, the Natural Resource Negotiation Playbook, and is a recipient of MIT's, oh gosh, I'm gonna mess this up, help me, Bruno, Darbeloff Award?
You've got it perfectly done.
Okay, Darbeloff Award for Excellence in Education, and MIT's Teaching with Digital Technology Award. So we're lucky to have such a wonderful teacher in our presence here. And so the other, building on negotiation strategy and conflict resolution coaching with cabinet officials, with C-suite negotiation strategy, C-suite executives and nonprofit leaders, as well as young professionals hailing from over 60 countries. His applied teaching and research manifests a multicultural heritage with roots in 3 continents. He'll maybe tell you about that, and diverse spiritual traditions. We have a true Renaissance man with us here today, and I'm sure you are going to enjoy your time with him today. So Bruno, take it from there.
Thank you so much, Donna, for the warmth leading up to this seminar in the past few weeks, and again for the inspiration now of many years that your work, both in writing and in action, has been for me and the many students that are fortunate to learn from your work at MIT and beyond. I'm certainly thrilled to be able to join through this initiative between the Weatherhead Center and PON so many different homes, office spaces across all time zones and around the planet. So I'm appreciative to the audience for the time that they give us to join you at your home and talk about something that we're all passionate, which is conflict resolution, by focusing on what kind of mindset, behaviors, values we can put into practice in subjects that in this occasion are centered in natural resource management, our relationship with the environment, our relationship with one another. I'll go to a screen share process. And the way I envision the conversation with you today is centered on empowering you to post a whole host of questions in the chat. And with Diane and Donna, I look forward to being able to provide coaching and a back and forth bouncing ideas with you in terms that are relevant and of impact in your own communities. So I'll go to screen share, set it up. No, when we talk about negotiating persuasively in a volatile climate, I wanted to give you a little bit of a feedback and a background in terms of the process, the emotional process behind the research that I'm fortunate to present with you today. And so my path in the field is really centered on interconnectedness. That is, who has been mentoring me, in what kind of situations or environments have I chosen to be involved and learn from. And so in that sense, I'm deeply grateful both to MIT Chancellor Melissa Nobles, who's guided me through this process for many years, and founder of the program negotiation, Professor Lawrence Susskind. The two of them really have been beacons of light for me. And whenever I'm doing my work, I look back to their guidance and the emotion and care with which they've inspired me. In this journey, of course, I had shared with you that our focus would be the impact of the over frequent, present wherever we go, droughts, storms, and fires. There's no doubt that across different continents, these serious challenges have increased in volatility, in their extreme impacts, and in their frequency. And they reveal, at least in our field, and I think all of you will agree with this perspective, they reveal that we have to think about which steps can we take at home, with our friends, in our family, in the communities where we conduct our professional path, whichever that path is. Which steps can we take to acknowledge that interconnectedness and lose the fear that we can sort out what the future holds, and on the contrary, tap that hope and confidence that our field, the field of conflict resolution and negotiation and mediation, is so convinced you just need to open the door for it to thrive. And so the research that I present to you, that I've been fortunate to do with MIT Press, centers on 12 steps, 12 effective steps in cross-boundary natural resource management negotiations. Now I'll go and I'll mention some of them. I'll mention all of them, but I'll just give you some concrete examples centered on two regions of this planet that present interesting challenges. That is, a developed economy with the might, power, and impact of the United States, and an emerging economy with its challenging situations, as it's the case of Mexico. And so how have these two countries found over decades the practices that create value and solve thoughtfully significant natural resource management challenges? And the way to think about these challenges is that the reason why they are riveting to study and hopefully to act upon is that nature really has a karmic sense of the impact across generations of our relationship with it and with one another. And so natural resource management challenges really asks of ourselves to look at everything that we do, our mindset, our behaviors, the steps that we take across time, And therefore, there's great hope if we can question, reframe, redefine, redesign what we do and how we treat one another. And you can persuade nature in one specific campaign with a compelling ad about a promise that you won't deliver on it. On the contrary, when you take the right steps, it responds to you. And when you don't, you pay the costs. And so it's a great teacher. And that's the energy behind my approach to the field of both environmental conflict resolution. But beyond that, any negotiation challenge that I've been fortunate to face, and as Donna was highlighting, I think that at the end of the day, whether I'm coaching a CEO or where I'm working with someone who's a teenager, it's all about how can we unlock and awaken that moral compass that tells us what do we really stand for, and then guides how we speak, how we think, and what kind of partnerships we forge. And so the very first step that I think it's important to emphasize in our field is the step of persuading the other side's back table to join us at the negotiating table. And in order to do so, we need to form alliances with such a back table. We need to have the other side sit down with us with a belief in the benefits that are to be reaped if we work together. So in natural resource management situations, particularly under the stress of storms and droughts and fires, it is often the narrative when we click on the media, when we put on TV, it's the narrative of the dangerous costs if we don't change our behaviors. Pretty much all top studies in neuroscience underscore that, on the contrary, what allows people to really commit over the long term for innovation and evolution is rather a sense of hope and achievement and improvement, and that can only be anchored on the benefits of action together. And those benefits usually require us to empower the other side to have a different perspective about the challenge that we face by sharing with them surprising insights and data. And so let me try to invite you to picture the Colorado River Basin, which serves over 40 million citizens in the United States and has a tremendous economic impact across the country and beyond, given all the agricultural land that depends on such a magnificent, beautiful river. And so there are 7 basin states. I'll mention them. There are California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. They share the Colorado River with Mexico, 2 states there, Baja California Norte and Sonora. And part of the journey of the management of the Colorado River predates our current era. The binational agreement between the 2 countries dates back to the 1940s, and that agreement itself is based on data from the 1920s. Data that at the time, that specific decade, would have such high levels of precipitation and was then used as the reference point that, to some extent, the river, as time has gone by and drought has increased, is already from the get-go, just from the data that was used as the reference point, overallocated. So the 2 countries, back in the 2000s, they realized, as it would be the case this very year, but already back in the 2000s, based on the data, they realized there's going to come a point in the 21st century where we're going to have to engage into shortages. That is, the amount of water that we traditionally manage is not going to be available for us. And we want to negotiate with one another how to actually, what will be the protocol that governs those shortages. And so the United States negotiated internally back during the George W. Bush administration what would be the protocol between the 7 basin states. And once they decided and finished that process, they went and knocked on the door of Mexico and said, here's the data. We should definitely engage in shortage dynamics. And Mexico, this is the ideal path that we foresee. The Mexican officials at the time saw that message and responded, no way we can say yes to shortages. It's political suicide. Anybody who engages in such a process is going to be eventually fired. So the Americans, and I remember all this information that I share with you is part of a research project where I was fortunate to speak with over 70 experts who were directly involved in the negotiations. I was a neutral. I observed the process from afar and tell it from the perspective of both sides at the highest level, president, all the way to perhaps not as famous a level, but equally crucial, the technical managers that oversee the data and provide the information that underpins the management of the river itself. And what they realize is if Mexico won't negotiate shortages, and what they also need to negotiate is about surplus, how could we, in an era of drought, create more water? What are the steps that are going to get us there? And what kind of approach should we pursue in the field when we negotiate with one another? And so the message was, well, first we need to overcome past grievances. And in order to identify sources of mistrust, both countries need at the highest level to have informal talks. I mean, the ambassador of Mexico in the US and the Secretary of the Interior, first Kempthorne, then Salazar, Bush administration, then the Obama administration. And let's meet every 2-3 weeks in a cafe for 45 minutes and talk about the grievances that we both feel we have with one another over the decades in terms of how we share the river. When you've dumped toxic waste, when you've not provided the resources at the allotted time, when you've had a negative impact on this or that community, when this environmental catastrophe occurred, did we clear the air? Did we map the costs of that conflict? Did we identify the sources of mistrust? Often not, but they realized that over 70 years, they had not really gotten on the same page. And if they wanted to restart a process of creativity, they needed to declare a new mandate. So once, after more than a year of conversations, that's at the dawn of the Obama administration, they realized, okay, there's enough clarity between how we see the problem that we can now publicly go and announce when the president of Mexico at the time, Felipe Calderon, visits Obama in the White House, we can announce the relaunch of Colorado River negotiations in tandem with Gulf of Mexico negotiations that I'll talk later on. And the mandate that we declare is we've cultivated rapport at the highest levels. We're going to stress the benefits of cooperation, and that's what's going to be conveyed in the press and in the internal memoranda. And we're going to announce that our negotiations are going to be collaborative. Now, picture yourself interviewing some of the water czars from some of the most important cities in the US, for example, Las Vegas, where the economy really hinges on water. Picture yourself interviewing Pat Mulroy, the water czar of the Metropolitan Water Agency in Las Vegas, who receives me for an interview at the Caesars Palace. And what she tells me is, Bruno, I mean, we don't believe when the Mexicans tell us that we can negotiate surplus. We don't see in which way we can generate those resources unless we readapt the protocol and our own back table, the United States federal government, both through the Secretary of the Interior and the Department of State, we render each of the 7 basin states active stakeholders in the negotiation process. No longer observers, not only providers of insights, but really we empower them at the table to come up with creative solutions. And what does this, how does it look like, a creative solution in this field? Well, for example, it turns out that if you adapt the protocol and you really foster an ownership of a solution, and you really look at the situation from both perspectives, you would realize that if you invite the US stakeholders to visit the Mexican side, you would realize that the canals that receive the water from the US side of the Colorado River and then allocated across Mexico, many of those are not lined at the time of the negotiations with concrete. So when you send the water, a significant amount of that water is lost due to seepage and evaporation. So what if we change our mindset and we invest on lining the canals, and then all of a sudden that water that used to be gone and that nobody was using is now available? But notice, it's no longer, it doesn't present a political conflict because it's not water that anybody else was depending on. So perhaps that excedent, if, for example, the water agencies that invest on lining the canals are from the US side, because those are the ones that have more financial resources, then they can purchase back some of the water at Mexican prices, which then affects positively the ratepayers at home in the US cities. And nobody in Mexico has been negatively affected. Now they have canals lined with concrete, and in future years, more availability of water. The users on the US side have water at a more affordable price, and you as a water side don't need to go and buy new, more contentious, more expensive water rights from agricultural actors on your own side of the border. And all of a sudden, a negotiation that was only about shortages now has been turned into one that includes surplus. Notice the change is just that I trust you enough to invite you to visit how the world looks like. And through those tours, change your mindset. Now that the way these two countries got there, they had an agreement since the 1940s. The canals were not lined with concrete since then, so it took them 70 years to come up with that conclusion. It talks about the level of mistrust. That was connected to also a commitment to send the best representatives to the negotiations. And so, for example, the Brown negotiation is widely known for producing some of the most interesting, brilliant, creative pedagogy in the field, and that's centered on role-play simulations. So when I was meeting with Deputy Secretary of the Interior, Mike Connor, and interviewing him in Washington, D.C., he was sharing with me that when the DOI was preparing for the negotiations with Mexico, they would first run role-play simulations, both with only with US government officials, both from the basin states and at the federal level. And in the negotiation, in the role plays, there would be roles for US officials and roles for Mexican officials. And they would film and track the behavior of the negotiators. And on the basis of those behaviors, they would notice on occasion some people that when in moments of stress would, how could I put it diplomatically, would get quite aggressive, would try to impose their will, would no longer try to put themselves in the other side's shoes. And on the basis of that data, then they would conclude, these actors are true patriots. But if we bring them to the negotiation, those demeanors, that decision to impose your will on the other side is likely to backfire, because experience of negotiating with one another underscores that you need to provide the other side a victory speech, a genuine victory speech on the merits, for that side to be willing to implement any agreement you reach. So it's not logical, therefore, to bring negotiators whose personality and attitude when a problem arises is to put the burden on the other side and turn aggressive. So instead, he said we would keep them in the teams that provide data, that evaluate our mandate, that examine the performance when we return from negotiation rounds with Mexico. But instead, to the negotiation, we would send the leaders who are brilliant enough to get past agency conventions, who are empowering each other to be creative, and we grant them broad authority so that they are not shackled, perhaps by some of the legal constraints that our current understanding of the world presents. And that proves certainly beneficial on both sides. Another element, of course, that you want to be able to expand the references. When you're negotiating, what steps are you taking to recruit neutral experts to rethink your approach to the problem? Well, now let me invite you to the warmth of the Mexican coast, the Gulf of Mexico, Tabasco, the home of Pemex, the important oil company that has financed the economy of Mexico for many decades, and that is currently in an important transformation. Well, back then in the 2010, the decision from the Mexican officials, and now I'm just shifting to a little bit of examples in the energy sector, the decision in Mexico was, how can we jointly, thoughtfully, with less environmental costs, deal with hydrocarbon resources that have already been sold to corporate interests at home in Mexico and abroad, and do it more thoughtfully and efficiently? Well, we need new partnerships, and the steps to get there, they require us to rethink how we traditionally negotiate diplomatically. And what you often will see, you see it often in UN situations, is one country sends a draft, a 30, 40 pager, what they think the treaty should look like, and then the country receives it, gets it translated to its own language, and spends 3 months looking at it, and then answers back with literally hundreds of annotations of why what you propose makes no sense and can work because of political, economic, and legal reasons. And so I take you to that moment in Tabasco and visualize the lead on the US side, Mr. Sullivan, very close at the time with Secretary Hillary Clinton, who had been empowered to rethink the process by which Mexicans and Americans would negotiate the sharing of hydrocarbon resources. And what he thought and what he proposed was, I believe that to a certain extent, we always start on the wrong foot because we go with the draft counter draft protocol. So what if we do it differently? And for the first 3 months, instead, we go to school together. Let's identify who's part of the 2 delegations. Let's pick 2 cities in the United States, New Orleans and Washington, D.C., Villahermosa and somewhere else in the Yucatan Peninsula and Mexico City. Let's choose together a set of neutral experts. We choose them together, both countries. We agree on their expertise on a whole host of subjects: politics, economics, drilling. And then we go to school together. We have workshops where they share with us their insights about how to best negotiate with one another, how to best address the complex subjects that we're going to see. And then after those 3 months where we share dinners, where there's moments for informal conversations, where we start to float ideas and we've given each other time to be creative, we start creating that treaty, that agreement with one another. Reference and impact of such an approach of getting on the same page, getting in tune, is that agreement between Mexico and the United States took 13 months from the launch of the negotiations to the end, and over 50 transboundary hydrocarbons agreements in the planet negotiated since the 1950s. So 50 agreements across the planet. The average time it usually takes to negotiate 5 years. 5 years. The complexity of the negotiation didn't get easier. Mexico and the United States had not shared hydrocarbon resources for more than 70 years. And yet they got on the same page because they started the protocol completely different, speaking the same language. And that's the key. You want to hold joint workshops and engage in tours and be present and showcase with your energy that you really care about creating a winning story for the other side. Other elements I would like to highlight in terms of highlighting the benefits, the 8th critical step, is that you want to test points of tentative agreement. As you seek trades across differences and you shape packages around incentives, what's crucial is that you really understand what kind of behavior you want the other side to be modeling. So, for example, in the news, you know that often the challenge between the United States and Mexico centers on the southern border of the United States and the impact of drug trafficking and migration. Well, the environmental NGOs that work in the region and have been worried for decades because of the tremendous catastrophe that has happened in the Colorado River Delta and the impacts that overuse in both countries has generated in the region. For many decades, they used to litigate on both sides of the border to try to get the 2 countries to be more proactive and creative. And they did not succeed in this approach of confrontation yet. When they changed their mindset and said, let me see, how could we be part of the negotiations by highlighting benefits? Well, here's a creative example. They realized, the invasive species that have developed, the invasive species of flora that have developed across time due to the absence of water in the Delta, counterintuitively, those invasive species use more water and grow bushes that are much larger. As a result of that, those bushes are used by drug traffickers and people who smuggle migrants because at the moment of the night, it's easier to hide behind them. Yet the native flora is very small bushes that use much less water. What if we propose to both sides of the equation, to the political officials, that they time consciously the moment in which they release the water to the specific times that science underscores that pollination would happen and that the right flora would take over the invasive species. And you know what? If you release the water and buy the right water rights at the good moments, it costs you a fraction of the amount of money that you spend in drug enforcement and trolling. And that's how they got both sides to agree. And in the last few years, there's been a renaissance in the Colorado River Delta in different parts of the region, with impacts, therefore, to the youth and the communities that now in the summers are able again to bathe in rivers that they only knew in stories when they went to bed from their grandparents back when the river still was flowing across the year. It's important to see the cross connections and figure out how to highlight the benefits of changing our behavior. Of course, in terms of leading with balance, what I've shared with you are different stories about a commitment of treating each other with dignity and respect, and trying to figure out how can you build a reputation for empathy. What struck me the most when I interviewed these experts across both sides of the border was the genuine appreciation that they had for one another and what's relevant in their communities. There was never a behavior where the other side was just trying to pull one over the other. There was genuine engagement to speak the same language and seize the day, because you have to deal in these moments of crisis, you have to pursue steps that build momentum. And that means that if you're going to be targeting incremental solutions, you need all the actors to be on the same page. And to be on the same page, I think that an important message as you look at the past few years and the politics in different countries is, how can we communicate in harmony? If you're going to be in a process of negotiation that takes multiple years, there's going to be periods of time where the press wants to know what you're doing. And unless you've negotiated internally that you're not going to be leaking on either side any story, because you respect one another and know that in the process of inventing without committing, you need each side to have the flexibility, the agility to rethink how they look at the world and approach it differently. If you don't embrace that process with the associated respect it deserves, you're going to create problems unilaterally. And so here perhaps the story that I think could be significant is that once the US and Mexico had an agreement both on shortage and surplus, that has been in action and enacted in the past few years, and certainly in the past few weeks when the drought in the Colorado hit. When it was going to be announced, the American stakeholders knew that often what the press in Mexico reveals comes straight from stories in the US press itself. And so, as I've shared with you, Mexico would sell a specific amount of water back to the US, but there's a history of mistrust. And the Mexicans clearly explained to the United States, if it is presented without the nuance to our audience, to our citizens, that we're just selling our own resources, they will call us sellouts. And that flexibility that we've created to one another, the fact that, yes, we sell you water, but in return, you store water for us for free at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, those stories that require nuance won't make it to the press. So when you announce the deal, you can't have the headlines and the stories be, we're purchasing water from Mexico. Well, Pat Mulroy tells me she wakes up at 4 a.m. after she had met with all the heads of the different TV stations in Las Vegas, and that's certainly told in much more detail in my book, Winning Together. And she realizes, well, I told them all how not to say that they sold us water because it would be misunderstood once it gets translated to the Mexican press. But I forgot that at the meeting, the person that writes the headline wasn't present. So she said, 4 a.m., I realized I have to call in a favor. I need to call my good friend, Harry Reid, at the time, the top Democrat in the Senate, and tell him, you've got to get control of who's going to write the headline and make sure that it explains a different thread of this binational agreement. Notice the contrast of how often when you see people come to the press and they're talking about a negotiation and they demean the counterpart. They don't care how they make it look like. They don't care about the impact in their press and in their nation. But all that you're doing with that behavior is reducing the maneuvering room of those who are willing to create value and who are willing to get on the same page. And that's what we need if we want to have follow through for success. And we want to incentivize dispute resolution that promotes testing and monitoring, and that rewards adaptation and progress in the natural resources that we hold dear. And so I hope that these examples are helpful, and I look forward to being able to catch up with each of you in the conversation now that Donna joins us again to go on the Q&A. Let me certainly express to all of you that I look forward to your questions. And again, if you want to know more about the research, Winning Together from MIT Press, and from the get-go, all the successes and blessings in the path that you're soon to experience across this fall, wherever I find you. So go ahead, Donna, ready to discuss.
Yeah, wow, that was remarkable, Bruno. And you know, I have to say, listening to you, it reminds me so much of the interactive problem-solving methodology that our beloved Professor Herbert Kelman developed. There's so many parallels. It's really remarkable. Unfortunately, he can't be here. He wasn't able to be here today, but I'm going to encourage him to listen to your recording, because there's such synchronicity. And thank you so much.
Well, Donna, there's no bigger honor. He's such a towering figure, and naturally we're going to be inspired by his wisdom. I'm so grateful.
Yeah. Well, let's see, Bruno, we have a couple of questions here right off the bat. So this is from Robin, and she wants to know how both of the parties could have expanded the pie to benefit both of the countries. And I think you've already pretty much touched on this, but maybe you want to, I mean, this is, you know, classic Roger Fisher methodology language here. So perhaps you could just
absolutely
expound on that a little bit.
Excellent question. I have, for example, I think would be good to give this perspective. Often in natural resource management negotiations, we need to speak the same modeling language. And so we need our technical experts to be able to tell us, hey, before you get into the nitty-gritty of navigating the politics of what might be feasible or not based on who put us in power, could we speak the same language? And what was interesting is that from 1944 all the way to 2010s, Mexico had a protocol and a process of gathering data and modeling the flows in the river and precipitation and drought and so on that was completely different from the one that the United States relied upon. And so when they would gather together to study projections about the future, they couldn't get on the same page without the same modeling data. And so it was easy for either side to accuse one another of cooking the books. And now you would think that since the 40s, they could have said, let's just agree on a cross-boundary modeling protocol, and let's make sure that we're always looking at the same data. But since there was a sense of mistrust, each side wanted to keep its own sources of information. Well, the shift was there indeed in those negotiations. Thoughtfully, the leaders said, you know what, let's spend, and it took time, let's spend over a year. And the US said, let's finance the trainings of the Mexican experts in getting to know something that is called WEAP, which is a specific technical model that the basin states use to model over long term the management of the river. And once those technical experts manage it, let's also give them several months to talk with the Mexican officials, the political officials, and figure out a new mandate and a new perspective of what they can do. And through that process, it was much easier, therefore, to be creative. And so speaking the same language, not only in demeanor and values, but also in terms of how we look and gather data, can only happen if we trust one another.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question from Camilla Novak. Can you see a similar process working between Israel and Jordan regarding the revival project of the Dead Sea? Do you know if such a process has been initiated? A contract has been signed 20 years ago, and the implementation has not started yet.
Well, Camilla, I appreciate very much the question that Donna shares so kindly, and I have two answers. First, just shoot me an email. There's a couple of colleagues at MIT, younger colleagues from the region, who are specifically studying the process of water diplomacy, the work that Shafiqul Islam at Tufts and Professor Soskan have led for many decades. And they are on the ground in specific cases studying the dynamics there, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with them. Now, the second angle is that the steps themselves that I've presented in Winning Together, they are transferable across regions. At the moment, I'm fortunate that both in Russia and in China, the book is getting translated. In the case of Russia, not specifically with any river, but rather with the behaviors and demeanors that some diplomats would like to see in action in their own negotiations in Eastern Europe. And in China, the internal negotiations between the different provinces in the management of the Yellow River. And I think that gives us hopes in terms of whichever situation you find yourself, if you enact and you find a touchstone of wisdom in terms of how people can treat one another, it goes across borders, and that's the key.
Yeah, you know, I'm curious, just to follow up on your 12 steps, and what kind of pushback do you get when you introduce these ideas? Because, you know, you mentioned that you start out going to school together, right? You said you bring the parties together and you educate them and share some resources and all that. Do you ever get, I mean, this seems like such a wonderful process and a foolproof one. Do you ever get pushback?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a tremendous question. Crucial that you ask it, Donna, for two reasons. Certainly the spoilers, people whose balance of power might be impacted by such a collaborative behavior are likely to try to push back. And I've got an example of it within this process itself. So it was a lengthy process, and even till the bitter end, particularly when they had to sign the deal, Mexico sent a last version of the treaty, and it has to be written in Spanish, even though usually the majority of the Mexican negotiators speak English. And when it got translated at the State Department, for confidentiality reasons, I cannot say who's the person who translated it, but the person who translated it decided not to put the footnotes that explained the last minute request that Mexico was making. So when the actual treaty got to the American stakeholders, they read those last minute requests and felt disrespected, felt offended, felt like there's not a rationale behind this. Is Mexico trying to just break us or push us now that we're so close? And it is only because the process itself had included the NGOs that the NGOs said, like, look, I mean, your document in English looks weird because it's less lengthy, and it doesn't have all these footnotes that we read in Spanish. So I'd say before you tell Mexico, go and use a bad word, could you ask them for a new document and make sure the translation has everything? And once they got the translation with the footnotes, then all of a sudden they could get on the same page. Now, the second element is there was pushback because Mexico and the US also share the Rio Grande. And there, the expanding the pie gets harder because the number of states that are involved is smaller. And so when the Senate representatives in Texas saw that the 7 basin states on the US side were willing to reach a deal with Mexico, they at the Senate were trying to block it. And the way they were able to protect the process is, well, 14 senators against 2 senators, you're still going to carry the day, particularly if it's both Democrats and Republicans on the 7 basin states. And so there's going to be pushback if the perspective of the status quo is that of confrontation, but you give yourself maneuvering room if you have a larger set of stakeholders involved who are keeping an eye and can coach you when a blind spot is coming your way.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. This is another question from an anonymous attendee. From your experience, Bruno, which stage takes the longest to reach the desired outcome?
Oh, well, it is probably the stage associated with getting on the same page. So all that period of the different working groups that thematically go about the different pieces of the puzzle that you can put together, because to some extent, negotiation is not getting into a boxing ring and trying to impose your will on one another. It's rather much more of a dance. And so that dance, finding the right melody, finding what's the right rhythm, what should be the choreography, that takes a lot of effort and understanding and flexibility and multiple rounds of meetings and so on, until you really get to a point, as John Ansminger, who was the deputy for Pat Mulroy, used to tell me. He told a story. He would have meetings in Las Vegas with internal stakeholders, then fly to San Diego later in the morning to negotiate with the Mexicans, then fly back to Las Vegas, and then come back later in the evening to continue a round of negotiation with the Mexicans. And he said, towards the latter part of the process, when I would come back, the people who would clap and celebrate that I was back was the Mexican delegation. That's how close we got to one another. And so, it takes time to develop that friendship, but it pays off.
Yeah, it's about trust building, basically,
Yes.
to know that you're genuine and sincere. And okay, so we have more. Maria Dure says different kinds of data knowledge are valued differently by different transboundary stakeholders. For example, the importance of quantitative data to water districts versus the importance of oral histories and qualitative data in tribal nations. How can we as practitioners help build across culturally disparate values and ways of conceptualizing the problem?
Certainly this is a fantastic question from Marie, in the sense that it fits the zeitgeist of our times, both in the US and in other countries, in terms of really recognizing that the way we relate with one another, how we see the world, is quite different. And what might be seen as a wise relationship with the river by a tribal elder might be very different from our understanding in certain communities, in terms of how in Wall Street this very same resource will be managed. And so there are 3 steps that I mentioned there that are important. In your selection of the representatives, when you're mapping the stakeholders, you have to empower stakeholders that have different perspectives, and move away from the fear that because they have different perspectives, they're just going to bog down the process and make it more complicated. What you have to do is figure out who is willing to join with the right intentions, who's willing to join to persuade others about a different perspective, but is willing to be persuaded too. Who has that openness? The second step is, when we're trying to get on the same page and highlighting the benefits across generations, particularly this qualitative data, is crucial to redefine our relationship with nature. Often, if we just go by the short term, the data that is relevant is very different than the one that older generations present. So something that was really interesting is that the NGOs, most of the stories that would accompany their purchase of rights would be preceded by ad campaigns that would involve elders from native tribes in Mexico, explaining what the river used to look like 30, 40 years ago before it was over allocated. And that connected emotionally with an audience, both in Mexico and the US, that did not confuse the more, I'd say, shady political perspectives that officials can have about what they would want to achieve. If they could see that if people have a connection with the land, and that makes it much harder then to exploit it. And so the third element, I talked a little bit about it, Maria, in terms of communicating strategically, just making sure that you have a narrative that is persuasive. And there, the story that I would highlight, I remember, is people in the north of Mexico know that the history of the country itself highlights that it's very centralized, and usually anything that happens in Mexico then gets contrasted with what the people in the capital city believe or think. And so when the deal was actually announced, all the major outlets in Mexico City wanted to do interviews, and both the Mexican officials and the NGOs agreed they would only do interviews with local agencies, because they wanted to make sure that it's only the people from the community who really know how to value the nuances get to talk about it, and they didn't want an involvement from central Mexico to make it more complex and create confrontation.
It just makes me think about these different cultural approaches to these matters, and how so many Native people believe in the dignity of the planet and the dignity of nature. And I'm just wondering whether you would ever try to use that concept of, yes, we are all, this is our shared home, we have to protect the dignity of all of our natural resources and nature itself. Is that any kind of language that you would ever use with the stakeholders?
I think, Donna, that's a next frontier. And I have a concrete example unrelated to Mexico. A few weeks ago, an important NGO here in the US was working with 7 different tribes in British Columbia, approached me as part of a process that they're leading to rethink the relationship that we have with nature based on Hawaiian traditions of spirituality in that karmic relationship with our planet. And what struck me the most in those conversations was that there's still a promising path of the next frontier in our field in terms of being able to speak in such a way about our mindset and relationship with nature, a much more spiritual, vulnerable, but genuine expression of the love and warmth that can come back and forth in terms of our relationship with the environment. I don't deny that we also live in an era often where the challenges that nature presents and presented in other generations are not as apparent. Rather, we're seeing the impacts of our behavior on it. Yeah. But I do believe that there's a disconnect. What we see in the outside world at the end of the day is a disconnect between what we prioritize and value. And if we shift internally, that provides the highest upside. No solution is most important than changing what we feel in our heart.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Julie Mullen has a question. Is it best to choose experts from countries other than the countries involved in the negotiations?
Oh, that's certainly, well, you know, what we saw, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico case, is that if you wanted an expert to talk about politics of the US and Mexico to another audience, you probably wanted people who spent decades in the region. But if you wanted an expert on how to best use natural gas or drill hydrocarbon resources, you could very well pick someone who just has a lot of experience with other treaties and can provide insights about, for example, the best engineering process to pursue. And so it's a tailored dynamic, particularly if you invite, for example, the NGOs. What you'll see is that that's people who are passionate, who fell in love with a region. On occasion, they were not born there at all. They may not even be a citizen of either of the two countries. But what's beautiful of natural resource management negotiations is that it's quite revealing, right? Often the people involved in such a situation have an attachment to the land, to the landscape, to the sounds, to the smells. And therefore, that's a promise of the behavior or the values that they'll put into practice, because to some extent, sometimes the dream is, I'm currently now enjoying this river with my son or my daughter. And I hope I protect that legacy, and my son and my daughter in a few years from now can be with their grandson, enjoying that very river. And that, I think that connection, that love can come through in these kind of negotiations.
All right, well, I think we probably have time for one more question before I turn it over to Nicole. But the question, Sebastian wants to know, how are successful negotiations possible if the two sides cannot agree on common data, like on climate crisis, where one side believes in the existence of it and the other does not?
Well, they get much more complicated, right? To some extent, if we won't agree on in a perspective, on a foundation of how we relate to the world, perhaps we're communicating to one another that we are not as willing to redefine our behaviors or our approach, and it is not a surprise, therefore, that problems don't get resolved. To some extent, there's common sense, wise behaviors that we can put to practice, and when we don't follow them, we make things much worse. And we can write many articles about it, but I think that when you are with family members you love, and your step to redress something in the world that is not working is to look inward and question how you've done things, how you think, whether you have really a positive mindset, whether you focus on what's creative. If you take that step, then you usually see reciprocity. And like in video games, to some extent, then you move to the next level. If you're stubborn and keep repeating the same behavior, you won't move up. It's up to us spiritually to make the decision.
It's a tough one, Bruno. That's a hard one. Let me see, maybe we have time for one more before I turn it over to one quick one. So Robin wants to know, were any climate activists involved? Whoops, where did it go? Were any climate activists involved in these negotiations? If not, do you think it would have been helpful to involve them?
Excellent question. Yes, they were. So most of the people from the Environmental Defense Fund and a whole host, there were 13 different NGOs involved. They often began their career as activists. They were frustrated by the lack of access to the decision makers. And what was creative was to really empower them not to be observers, but rather be part of the process and contribute. And as I shared, as I wrap up in that story, they went beyond. You don't think that the person who's going to save the day is the NGO expert who speaks the two languages and can look at your final deal between political officials. And so I wrap up with that, and just deep gratitude to both Nicole and Donna and Diane and James for inviting me today to join you. Thank you so much, and all the blessings.
It has been our pleasure. I can promise you that. And Nicole, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Donna and Bruno, I mean, what a wonderful way to kick off back to school and really a whole season of events for PON and the Weatherhead Center. We have a whole slate of things coming your way. Our next Kelman Seminar is going to be with Mari Fitstuff on October 14th. Our Brains at War, the Neuroscience of Conflict and Peace Building. Really fascinating topic. Really looking forward to having her here. On the PON side, we have got a whole slate of events that we are scheduling now, and we're going to have our calendar updated soon. But Shriti Desai, Dolly Chu, former HLS Dean Martha Minow is going to be speaking in December, I believe. We're getting those dates down, and you're going to see them on the calendar. And then I will mention that coming up, we have two special PON expertise one-day events where we will be allowing folks to delve more deeply into a singular subject of interest. So first in October, Negotiating the Impossible with Professor Deepak Malhotra of Harvard Business School. Those are for those really sticky negotiations and conflicts. And then, of course, Dan Shapiro from Harvard Medical School on the power of emotions when one is negotiating. So we look forward to seeing you at all of these events, PON Live, Kelman Seminars, and of course, our executive education trainings. Thank you so much, Bruno Verdini, for a wonderful and inspiring presentation today. Donna, always a pleasure to partner with you. And to everyone, we wish you a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your night, and a great start to the weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.